From the outside, Marcus's life looked exactly like what success was supposed to look like when it was finally arriving. He had done the work that most people talk about doing and never actually do, had made the changes that required something real from him, and sustained them past the point where motivation runs out and discipline has to carry the rest of the weight. He was more focused than he had ever been in his life, more deliberate about where his time went and who had access to his energy, more consistent in the habits that were slowly compounding into something he could see clearly when he looked at the trajectory of his days. The distractions that had once consumed entire evenings and entire weekends had been systematically removed. The habits that had been working against him for years had been replaced one by one and through sustained effort with ones that served the direction he had chosen. The future, when he looked toward it, finally appeared to be moving in a way that matched the vision he had been carrying for a long time. He had become, by every external measure he knew how to apply to the question, the version of himself he had spent years working toward becoming. And yet something was wrong in a way he couldn't immediately identify or find adequate language for. Not painful in any way that demanded immediate attention or produced the kind of distress that makes the source of the problem obvious. Not dramatic enough to interrupt the functioning of the life he had built or give him a clear reason to stop and examine what was happening underneath the surface of all the visible progress. Just a feeling of disconnection that sat quietly beneath everything, a subtle but persistent sense that something essential was absent from the days that looked, from the outside, exactly like what he had been working toward. Empty in a way he couldn't explain to himself, let alone to anyone else who might have looked at his life and seen nothing but evidence of things going well. He kept moving because stopping was not something the version of himself he had built knew how to do without immediately reinterpreting the stopping as failure or regression or the beginning of a slide back toward everything he had worked so hard to move away from. Wake up at the time he had decided was optimal, move through the morning routine he had refined over months into something efficient and productive. Work with the focused intensity he had trained himself to sustain, improve in the specific areas he had identified as requiring improvement, repeat the following day without deviation. The process continued exactly as it was designed to continue, producing exactly the outputs it had been calibrated to produce, and Marcus showed up for it with the consistency that had become one of the things he was most privately proud of about who he had become. But somewhere in the middle of a Tuesday that looked identical to the Tuesday before it, and the Tuesday before that, something in his honest awareness surfaced a thought he had been moving past without fully receiving. He was no longer living inside his life the way a person lives when life feels like something happening to and with and through them. He was optimizing it, managing it, running it through the system he had constructed with the same relationship to it that an engineer has to the machine they are operating, present and attentive and in control, but not inside the thing in any way that felt human. Every moment had become, without him deciding this was what he wanted, raw material for the ongoing project of improvement. Every decision had become calculated against the metric of whether it moved him forward or represented time that could have been spent more productively. Every relationship, every conversation, every experience had been unconsciously evaluated for its contribution to the larger optimization project his life had quietly become. And the person doing all of this, the person waking up each morning and executing the process with genuine discipline and genuine commitment, had started feeling emotionally absent from his own existence in a way that was becoming increasingly difficult to continue not noticing. The truth, when it finally surfaced fully enough that he couldn't continue moving past it, arrived not with the force of a dramatic revelation, but with the quiet and slightly devastating quality of something that had been obvious for a while before the person it concerned was ready to look at it directly. He had spent so much sustained effort becoming stronger, more disciplined, more capable, more controlled, that somewhere in the years of that effort he had lost his connection to the actual experience of being alive, in the way that aliveness is supposed to feel from the inside. Not because anything had been taken from him, but because he had gradually and without intending to traded the texture of genuine human experience for the smooth and frictionless efficiency of a life run as a self-improvement project. Peace had disappeared not because his circumstances were difficult, but because peace requires the capacity to be present without immediately converting the present moment into an opportunity for productive activity, and that capacity had been so thoroughly trained out of him that he could no longer access it even when he tried. The ability to enjoy things without simultaneously evaluating them had gone. The experience of simply existing in a moment without the part of his mind responsible for optimization running in the background had become something he could remember but could no longer reliably produce. He had turned his life into a constant and unending project of becoming something better than what he currently was, and the cost of that project, the cost he hadn't seen listed anywhere in the literature about discipline and self-development that had guided the years of work, was the lived experience of the life he had been improving toward. Growth without any anchor in genuine meaning or genuine feeling, he understood now with the clarity of someone who had arrived at a truth through living it rather than reading it, eventually becomes a sophisticated form of emptiness. Not the emptiness of a life going nowhere, the emptiness of a life going somewhere efficiently with no one fully present for the journey. And Marcus sat with that understanding long enough for it to settle into him completely before he decided what to do with it. He did not respond to what he had understood by dismantling what he had built or abandoning the discipline that had produced genuine and valuable change in who he was over the preceding years. He was not looking for a reason to stop doing the work. He had no interest in using the realization as justification for returning to the easier and less demanding version of his life that he had spent years moving away from. What he changed was his relationship to all of it, the orientation he brought to the process rather than the process itself, beginning with the simple and initially uncomfortable act of allowing spaces in his days that were not assigned a productive purpose before they began. Silence that wasn't being used to think through problems or plan the next phase of something. Walks taken without the optimization of a podcast or an audiobook running in the background, converting the time into a learning opportunity. Conversations entered without the part of his mind that was always calculating what could be extracted from the interaction for use elsewhere. Meals eaten without a screen or a book for the sole purpose of tasting the food and being present in the physical experience of eating it, which turned out to require more conscious effort than it should have after the years of training himself to treat every moment as a resource to be allocated efficiently. He allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, to simply exist in the present moment without the constant pressure of converting that existence into evidence of forward momentum. And it was genuinely difficult at first, more difficult than he had expected it to be, which told him something important about how thoroughly he had trained the capacity for simple presence out of himself in the service of becoming someone more disciplined. But he stayed with the difficulty the way he had learned to stay with every other kind of difficulty, not by pushing through it as fast as possible to get to the other side, but by remaining present inside it long enough to understand what it was asking of him. What it was asking was simple and had nothing to do with achievement. It was asking him to come back to his own life, not the optimized version of it, the actual one. And slowly, without any single moment where everything resolved itself into the satisfaction he had been expecting achievement to produce, something in the quality of his daily experience began to shift in a direction that felt more honest than anything the preceding years of disciplined improvement had delivered. Life started feeling real again in the way that things feel real when you are actually present inside them rather than managing them from a slight remove that keeps you efficient but costs you the experience of being genuinely alive to what is happening. The work was still there, and he still showed up for it with the consistency and the commitment that had become genuine features of who he was rather than performances he was putting on for an imagined audience. But there was something present alongside the work now that had been missing from it for years, the awareness that the work was happening inside a life, not instead of one. That the discipline and the growth and the forward momentum were valuable because of what they allowed him to experience and contribute and become in the full context of a human existence, not as ends in themselves that justified the sacrifice of the very experience they were supposed to be serving. He had spent years becoming someone capable of building the life he wanted, what he had needed to learn, and what the emptiness had finally taught him in the only way certain lessons can be taught was how to actually live inside it once it arrived. Not as a project, not as a performance of having figured something out, but as a person present and connected and genuinely there for the ordinary and extraordinary moments of a life that had always been more than the sum of its productive outputs. The point of growth had never been to become someone who had optimized themselves past the capacity for genuine feeling. The point had always been to build a life that felt fully alive while living it. And Marcus, for the first time in a long time, was beginning to understand what that actually meant from the inside.